of the three major parties. This will be part one of a series over the next 5 weeks, taking us right up to Election Day, which will focus on election 2025 in Canada. I'm Robert McGilvery.
And I'm Fareed Khan, and today we're going to discuss one of the most consequential federal elections in generations, one where the Canadian economy and Canadian sovereignty are under threat. And the topics that we're going to focus on in this episode are what the polls are saying about each party and what that means for the election and for Canadians, the impact that Donald Trump is going to have on this election and how his policies are reshaping the world order and impacting Canada, and military spending.
Great. So the first topic we're going to cover is the parties in the polls. And one of the most disappointing ones for me is that the NDP is now under 12%. And I mean, I can understand why that's happening. Like, what are your comments on that, Fareed?
Well, I mean, if anybody's been following the last few months of polling, back in December, no one could have even imagined the Liberals having a chance of being reelected to another government. And now that has been totally turned on its head. The Liberals were about at one point 25 points behind the Conservatives, and the Bloc Québécois was set to become the official opposition with the NDP even polling ahead, or because of the way their votes are gathered across the country, they could have come out ahead of the Liberals, and the Liberals could have ended up in fourth place. But then in early January, Justin Trudeau announced his resignation. There was a very fast leadership, and the Liberals elected Mark Carney. And throw into that mix the threats by Donald Trump of a trade war against Canada and to annex Canada as the 51st state, and it's a whole new ballgame. We now have a situation where the Liberals and the Conservatives are literally neck and neck, and a lot of that bleed towards the Liberals is coming from the NDP and the Bloc Québécois, who now, in the case of the NDP, if the trend continues, they could end up not even having party status.
Yeah, I think a lot of NDP voters know that their vote often doesn't count towards winning in their riding, and they do a strategic vote. So they often vote Liberal in order. And I must admit, I've probably done that once myself because, they do that strategic vote in order to get Liberals in rather than Conservatives, which generally represents more left-wing positions than right. And I think the main reason why Poilievre lost so much of the popular vote was that he's seen as possibly a mini Trump, or very much in line with the Trump, and even some of his lines. I would say his lines tag his top three lines tag with Trump's top three lines. So Trump's drill baby drill aligns with Poilievre's let's get as many resources out of the ground that we can. And while I agree that Canada is a resource-based nation and we do need to promote those resources, in Poilievre's case, I think he's mainly talking about oil, because he's specifically mentioned the pipeline and Carney's opposition to the what's it called, the Trans Mountain pipeline that was completed last year, and so he's very much pro-oil, just like Trump. He does not seem to care about the climate change. So he actually said in North York yesterday, he accused Carney and the Liberal Party of the radical net zero environmental extremism, when most of the world is realizes that climate change is the problem of our generation, the past two generations even. He's calling it extremism. And then the third point, he wants to cut foreign aid. Look what Trump did with US AID. So he did the same thing. And so the fact that he's considering cutting foreign aid, and while he promotes it as he doesn't want to fund dictators and terrorists, I mean, it's a very simplistic view of the world of foreign aid and how that can significantly, impact democracy across the world.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned a number of those points. Yesterday, I think it was yesterday, Danielle Smith, Premier of Alberta, was on a podcast with Breitbart, which is a far-right media outlet, some would even say fascist media outlet in the U.S., who are huge supporters of Trump. And she went on there to say that, that Poilievre aligns with Trump's ideology, which I'm sure, like there were conservative operatives who were just pulling out their hair when
Yes.
that news came up.
Yeah.
And to your point of simplistic messaging, you are absolutely right. You look at the way that Poilievre presents his ideas, and you compare it to the way that Trump campaigned for the presidential election last year. And I think that a lot of Canadians have now seen this. There is an ad, and I think if it's not by the Liberal Party, it's by a group that's affiliated with the Liberal Party that shows Trump and Poilievre side by side, and Trump says something, and then they go to Poilievre saying the exact same thing. Trump, and like they do that 3 or 4 times, and basically making the case that this is not the guy who you think he is, and he's more like Trump than you know, and basically presents a danger. And I'm also seeing other commentary saying that if Poilievre were to be elected prime minister, he would basically tank the Canadian economy and hand the Canada over to the U.S. on a silver platter. So he's got a lot to try and overcome in the next 5 weeks, and it remains to be seen whether he will be the Pierre Poilievre we've seen for the last number of years. This very brash, and at times irrational
Yeah.
politician, or whether we're going to see a statesman. And right now, I think Canadians are looking for a calm, cool head, a statesman to go against Trump.
They are, and I think he's going to change his tone. And in fact, the couple of things I watched from him, it's already changed a bit. Yes, he's doing the usual attacks on the Liberals and Carney, but it's really toned down. He's not attacking in the same vicious manner he was previously. He's not making the same number of false claims that he's making. I think he's made. I feel he's made one or two, in my opinion. I didn't completely fact check. I mean, mainly the one where the other Trumpism, where he's talking about crime is increasing in Canada. And I haven't checked the numbers on that. Certainly, crime has been up and down the last number of years. Has it increased in the last few years? I'm not 100% sure, but certainly that's a line out of the standard Trump line. But he's definitely. I mean, he is a seasoned politician. And I still think it remains to be seen whether he'll believe it. And the vote is still close between Liberals and the Conservatives, so it remains to be seen whether he'll be able to swing that or not. And he's definitely changed his tactics.
Yeah, I think when the when the election was announced, the news outlets were carrying some polls, and it showed basically the Liberals at 37.6%, and the Conservatives at 36 or 37.1, essentially within the margin of error.
Yeah.
But the fact that they are essentially tied actually gives an advantage to the Liberals, because
Yes.
if people can recall, back in the last election in 2021, the Liberals actually got less of the popular vote than the Conservatives did, but they got a significantly larger number of seats in the House. So it remains to be seen, though, because one of the things that's different about this election, other than the fact that it's so existential, is that we've gotten 5 new seats across the country, and riding borders have been realigned, and this happens every 10 years after the census, so it's par for the course. But those differing borders are going to play into how many seats one party or the other gets in different parts of the country.
Great. I actually think, I mean, this whole thing, and why we say it's one of the most monumental elections, as you were saying, that's going to happen in a long time. I think we're going to be backsliding as a country. I sort of feel that there's been this whole distraction thing. Don't focus on these issues. Focus on these issues. So I mean, over the last 10 years, I think we've put too much focus on, let's say, the transgender issue. While it is an issue and why those people need to be treated well, it was overly focused on compared to, let's say, climate change, and wealth inequality wasn't talked about at all. And so I'm concerned that we're going to backslide, and we're seeing that already with Carney actually removing the carbon tax on consumerism. It's a backslide of dealing with climate change. And in terms of dealing with wealth inequality, they're already going to remove that increase to the capital gains tax that they added in a number of years ago, or just a couple of years ago, I think it was. And they're going to increase the capital gains tax for businesses, small businesses, once they sell their businesses, from 1 million to 1.25 million. And I don't see any talk of addressing the wealth.
You mean the threshold that where the
It's
tax takes?
the exemption amount or whatever that's
Yeah, so
exempted
that's the
from.
threshold, the
Yeah,
minimum amount that where taxes will come in.
yeah, exactly. You're right. Yeah. Um, so basically, we're seeing a backslide now. So I sort of feel there's this whole distraction thing. It's almost like, is it the newspapers owned by the uber rich that are actually promoting these whole distraction? So now the left wing and the whole picture of attacking the left wing versus right wing. Now it's Canada versus Trump or Trump versus the world. And now we're focused on that topic rather than dealing with the main issues of wealth inequality and climate change. And we're seeing a slip back already of Canada is dealing with climate change. So all the parties, or the two main parties now, have less of a focus on climate change and more of a focus on dealing with Trump. And I
Well,
think that's bad. Yeah.
I can see why you would say that it is a distraction, and in some ways, yeah, it is a distraction,
Yeah.
but it's also a very real concern because if a guy is threatening to set your house on fire, you don't ignore them,
No,
right?
that's true.
Essentially, that's what Trump is doing. He says, "I'm going to set your house on fire. Once you're all gone, I'm going to take over your land," and that's essentially what the tactic is that he's using. And I've been obviously, like a lot of Canadians, I've been following this issue not only on social media but on various media outlets, and there are actually people talking about, well, there's a very real possibility that Trump might use the military, the U.S. military, to achieve his end goals if Canada doesn't give him what he wants. And of course, and you have essentially a united front among all the premiers, but the one standout is Danielle Smith, who seems to be only in it for Alberta, who made all kinds of demands to Mark Carney when she had her first meeting with him, including lifting all kinds of exemptions on greenhouse gas emissions, on restrictions on being able to access the eastern and western seaboard, and the elimination of tanker traffic in the most ecologically sensitive areas. That's something that's there that BC actually wanted in a previous government, and she wants that eliminated. So essentially, we've got everybody on board pretty much except one spoiled child, which is Alberta.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. I mean, and I think you've got some points on this one as well, but I do think, I mean, it could be a wake up call when Trump is actually pulling back from his role of, or the U.S. role of being the international police force or the world's police force, the world's defender of democracy, et cetera. He seems to be pulling back from that role. And it is a wake up call to the rest of the world to say, wow, we may not be able to always rely on the U.S., and we're going to have to potentially take care of ourselves in some cases and step up. And step up both militarily, but also step up maybe economically and, just playing a bigger part in the world and not relying on the US. Maybe that could be, I mean, I think that'll be very damaging in the short run, but maybe that could be beneficial in the long run, and that countries will become more independent and countries will possibly stand up to the economic control the US seems to have over the world, or at least a good portion of it.
Well, I'm not sure, if you recall the 1980 election, which was the free trade election, where
Yeah.
Brian Mulroney campaigned on entering a free trade agreement. And there was this one campaign ad in that election, which I remember distinctly. And it showed a map of Canada and someone taking an eraser and erasing the borderline between Canada and the US. And, at the time, that seemed to be a bit extreme, but how prescient was that? In the context of what we're facing today.
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, culturally, we're very similar to the U.S. in some ways, but completely different in others. And so it is interesting. I was sort of thinking the other day, could we have a more open border between Canada and the U.S.? Like, it's not like we have a lot of differences. I could see problems with that, but if if peace continued the way we had it and good relations, we could have a more open border, and we generally do have a fairly open border between Canada and U.S. Although it's sort of slipped back and forth over the years to become more strict, less strict, etc. Um, I don't think there's a big risk of that. I mean, someone even asked Trump at one interview, would you use military? Like, it's scary that someone even asked the question, but they did ask the question, would you use like military against Canada? And he said no, he would never do that. And
Yeah,
I've
but
even
I mean,
heard,
look who you're
yeah,
talking to, right?
that's true. You can't trust them, but at the same time, it's a little bit scary, and that somebody even asked the question. And I did hear from someone, from that posted somewhere from the U.S. military, but I mean, this is just one opinion, is that, you know, I don't think there'd be a. I would like to think there'd be a lot of people in the U.S. military that would not follow orders to attack Canada, like without reason, just because Trump wants to seize power. But who knows? They do follow their orders there, and they do. And military is trained to do that anyway. But it would be curious. I would like to think they would never do something that would be so reprehensible.
Yeah, but you know what? The U.S. has this tradition where whoever the president is, everybody falls in line with whatever the president's agenda
Yeah,
is.
that's true. Yeah.
However, what I would like to know is when you have clearly someone who's clinically insane, which Trump seems to be,
Yeah.
is the military and is the CIA and all the security agencies, are they going to follow the instructions of the president? And will they basically, like Trump's installed loyalists at the heads of the FBI, the
Yeah.
CIA, the National Security Agency, and so forth? Are these agencies, the career people in these agencies, are they going to sit there and do things which fundamentally go against the oath they have taken to defend the US Constitution and to enemies, both foreign and domestic? Because I think that um, this instance counts as as a situation where there is a domestic enemy, and that domestic enemy is sitting in the White House.
Yeah. Well, some have said this is probably the biggest internal threat the U.S. has ever faced, with Trump trying to dismantle the infrastructure, the institutions they have in place, which protect against moving to an autocracy or a dictatorship. And like, I would put it somewhere at what 80% that he's not going to relinquish power in 4 years, and that
Oh,
they're
they're
going to
already
face the
talking about a
constitution.
third term.
Yeah, he is.
I mean, yeah, there's like already, people talking about. There was a congressman who put in place a resolution in the House to allow Trump to run for a third time.
Wow. Okay, that's
Because, and the
interesting.
logic behind that is that the constitutional provision only applies if you run back to back and win, only then. But he hasn't run back to back. He had a break, and therefore he can actually go ahead and run for a third term.
Oh, that's interesting. So there might be a constitutional crisis over that, going to probably the Supreme Court to argue whether you can run again. But we'll see. That'll be
Among
something
many
to watch.
constitutional
Among
crises.
many, yes. So far, he seems to be ignoring some of the. It's interesting. He seemed to ignore some of the judge's decisions on like the plane going to Venezuela, I believe it was, or
Yeah,
Argentina,
yeah.
and they didn't turn around and they just ignored the judge's order that it should be turn around and no more flights, and they ignored it. And what happened? Like, who was arrested? Who was found in contempt of court? I don't think anybody was. Like, there's going to have to get a point where the judge administration ignores a report, and then the judge orders that these people be arrested who are senior officials in the government, and that's when the test will come. But until that happens, we won't know what'll happen to that situation. So
Yeah, and I think it's at that point I think that the military is going to have to decide, are they going to let this happen? Because when a sitting president starts ignoring the Constitution and ignoring the laws of the land, then what are you supposed to do? Do you just go ahead and follow the orders of this person, or do you do you actually intervene?
hmm
And
yeah,
and given that the Supreme Court is essentially a Trump-owned Supreme Court, although who is the Chief Justice? John, what's the Chief Justice's name? Anyway,
John
the Chief
Call.
Justice basically pushed back against Trump when he was calling for that judge to be impeached who had halted one of his policies.
Okay, so let's move on to another topic: military spending. And so there's a lot of talk now about this, and there does seem to be an impetus in Canada to increase military spending to our 2% minimum spending commitment, as most countries are supposed to meet, but apparently don't. What's your comments on that, Fareed? Or
Well, like there's all this focus on Canada, and Trump has been basically bitching and complaining since his first administration. But Canada is not the laggard that it's made out to be. Um, Now these figures are in U.S. dollars, but our military spending is 1.39 of GDP, and that amounts to $29.53 billion U.S., which is something like 40 billion plus Canadian.
That's
Uh,
1.39%, you're saying, eh? Of our
yeah,
GDP, yeah.
1.39%.
Yeah.
But there are other countries that are spending less than we are, and like for example, Italy is just actually above us. It's the next one above us. It's spending 1.46%. There are 21 countries in NATO that do not meet the 2% threshold. So that's over 2/3 of the NATO members who are not meeting that threshold. The one that is actually spending the most in terms of GDP is Poland, which is spending 3.9% of their GDP, which comes out to 31 billion and change in US dollars. And of course, the biggest spender is the US, and just by virtue of the size of their economy, they're spending 3.5% of GDP, which amounts to $955 billion US. And just to put that
Yeah.
number into context, that
Massive.
is more than the next 10 largest military spenders in the world combined. So while there's a lot of talk going on about increasing military spending, this is not something that can happen just by turning on a tap, because military procurement takes time. And if something were to happen next week, which required a swift military response, I'm not sure that Canada or NATO, without the U.S., would be prepared to meet the challenge.
Well, we
Because the
certainly
U.
wouldn't be right now. I mean, we don't have the troops or the forces and the infrastructure to do it without the U.S., I don't think.
No, we don't. We don't. Actually, right now, I've got some numbers for Canada. Right now, our combat military personnel strength is at 66,000. We've got 83 combat aircraft, which CF-18, which is, there was a report just this past week from on the news saying that only about 2/3 of them are operational. The rest are in repairs or maintenance. We've got 12 combat naval ships. So, in the grand scheme of things, we don't have a large military force. And it was the same way
Like,
with Canada.
I gotta ask you a question. Do you agree that we should increase our military spending to the 2% or even higher? Or what is
I
your
think it
thoughts
should.
on that?
Yeah, I actually do. I
Yeah.
think, and people have talked about, military spending like it's this something that we shouldn't even look at. There's people who've been wanting to reduce the military even further.
Yeah.
But the thing is, having a strong military is like buying insurance. You buy insurance, you never use it, but you're glad it's there when you need it.
Exactly. Yeah.
And that's the same thing with the military. It may not be something that you want to spend money on given the amount of money that's being spent, but when you need it, you want it to be there. And right now, Canada, and frankly, the militaries of most of the Western Alliance and NATO, is at the same stage as we were in the 1930s before the run up to World War II. Now, in the span of a few years, all these countries, the Allies, suddenly became military powerhouses. Canada ended up having the fourth largest air force and the fourth largest navy in the world by 3 years into World War II. And now we have a situation where Trump is allying the U.S. with Canada's adversaries, with
Hmm.
Russia and with China, which means that I think that we can't trust the U.S. to be a partner in defense, whether it's of Western Europe or of North America.
I mean, my own opinion is that, we should be reaching that 2% minimum. It's a NATO commitment, and the world is not a safe place yet. We don't have a peaceful world. In fact, the world maybe has gotten less peaceful in the last 5 or 10 years. I'm also disappointed that Canada used to be recognized as an international peacekeeper, and we
Yep.
now no longer have any peacekeeper troops at all. We just have some support personnel. And to compare this, I mean, the top UN peacekeeping country contributors in the world are Nepal, Bangladesh, Rwanda, and India, and all those countries have over 5,000 participants in the UN peacekeepers, with over 4,000 or over 5,000 troops each. Both France and Spain have over 600 troops, which are actual troops, peacekeepers, and Italy has over 900. Even Ireland has over 350 troops. So, I mean, Canada has zero actual troops in the peacekeeper forces, and we have maybe under 30. Us in Australia have no actual troops, but under 30 participants in supporting role. And to me, it's like Canada can't be insulated. We can't. We need to play a role in the world stage, and we have I think we have an obligation as a country of the world to participate in that peacekeeper. And I think the military supports this as well. I mean, I think their main goal is to have military. Their primary purpose is to have a military which is military effectively. But I think most military members would recognize that peacekeeper is an important role that Canada can play. And and also it has, I'm sure it has lots of other roles, like if the military is not, is not performing their military role in a combat or a war or a conflict situation, they have other roles they can play in supporting whether it's a natural disaster or whether it's an issue going on in the rest of the world. I mean, they do have other roles they can play. Um, I'd also like to mention that, like Sweden, for example, has a very strong military, and they reinstituted back in 2018, I believe it was, the mandatory service. And that doesn't mean everyone at age 18 goes through mandatory service, but I've read that it's about 5% of their people that get they all have to apply for it or submit an application, and only 5% get selected. But to me, it seems like a good idea. I'd be curious to hear what the rest of Canadians think, but to me, it seems like a good idea to have that sort of military service to bring the country together and to show that commitment to both the country and the world. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in the context of what's happening in the world today, there needs to be more robust military. The Canadian forces have fallen behind on their recruitment. They are actually below what their targets are. The largest post World War II military, the largest number of personnel that they had post World War II was actually in the early 80s when we were in the height of the Cold War with the Soviet Union. And then, then the Soviet Union broke apart. There was a so-called peace dividend, and things started to slide at that point. But right now, given what we see happening in Ukraine, given that Russia is threatening Eastern Europe, the Eastern European allies in NATO, given that China has its eyes on annexing Taiwan, which they've been wanting to do for decades, and now that Trump is talking about, annexing Canada, taking over Greenland, the Panama Canal, and Gaza, it's basically given a green light to both Vladimir Putin and President Xi of China to say, well, hey, if the U.S. is on board with this, then I don't think there's anything wrong with us doing what we're going to do. And that is the destabilization of the world that we can foresee if we don't basically step up and increase our military effectiveness, increase our numbers, increase our ground forces, our air force, and our naval personnel. Because as I said, this is insurance you hope that you never have to use, but if the time arrives, you want it to be there so that you can defend your values, your democracy, your freedom. And essentially that's what NATO has been about for the most part since it was created back in the early 50s.
Mm. Another thing the military is looking at, and that Carney has announced, is to relook at the purchase of F-35 aircraft, and which I think is a good thing, but at the same time, I don't know if it'll really change things. We're so in bed with the Americans in that sense. But I would like to see a better, a more like building Canada approach, or a more innovative approach in Canada. Like, we need to build our industries. We need to have innovation in Canada. I would like to see a better focus on building in Canada. But I don't think that's on the table right now. I think we're looking at the F-35 fighters, and others saying we might look more at the Gripen fighters from, which I think is from Sweden as well.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that the first time I saw the idea of us canceling our F-35 purchase was a meme on Facebook.
Yeah.
And then I saw the news article which said that Carney had instructed Bill Blair, the defense minister, to take a second look. Now, the thing is that Canada has been supporting the development of the F-35 since the I think it was the Chrétien era. Um, but as time has passed, the F-35 has become a white elephant. Essentially, what they want is they want a Swiss Army knife of an aircraft. And the thing with a Swiss Army knife is, yeah, you're glad to have it, but that's not the tool you want to use if you're doing delicate surgery.
Yeah,
You know,
that's a good
uh,
metaphor. Yeah.
yeah. And the thing is that as the costs have increased, so have the problems with the F-35. The General Accounting Office of the U.S., which is like the Parliamentary Budget Officer in Canada, has been constantly monitoring spending on the F-35. And in 2024, they came out with a report saying that there have been more increasing problems and less effectiveness of the F-35. And in fact, the Pentagon has, they haven't come out and admitted it, but they see the problem with the F-35 also, to the point that they've already put in place a program to develop a sixth generation fighter. And they actually built and tested a sixth generation prototype 2 years ago. I mean,
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
that's
Okay.
the lack of confidence that there is in the F-35. And we're not the only ones that are looking at revisiting our F-35 purchase. Portugal has basically canceled their purchase. And in our case, we started with four players. We had Lockheed, which makes the F-35, Saab, which makes the Gripen, Airbus, which makes the Eurofighter, and Dassault, which makes the French aircraft, the Rafale. Now, the Eurofighter and Rafale, the two manufacturers pulled out of the competition, leaving it to be a one-on-one face-off between Saab and Lockheed. And after campaigning in 2015 that Canada would not buy the Lockheed F-35, Trudeau goes ahead and approves the F-35 for purchase. And so I
Yes.
think that, another list on the list of broken promises.
Yeah.
And the thing with Saab is that not only is it an effective aircraft, it's also the least expensive aircraft to buy and operate. And as well, Saab had promised technology transfers, which meant that Canada could have evolved the aircraft within the Canadian aerospace sector. And I wrote a blog about this a few years back, talking about how Canada can take a lesson from Sweden, which has been building their own fighter jets since the 1940s. And that Canada should follow that example. And think about it: you've got a country
Yeah.
that is a third the size of Canada in terms of GDP, a quarter of the population, and yet they have built some of the most effective and lethal fighter jets that there were outside of the Soviet Union and China. And I think that Canada should follow that example.
I fully see that as well, but it almost seems like there's back currents in discussions between Canada and the U.S. where Canada doesn't want to challenge certain businesses of the U.S. and we face a lot of uphill battles. I mean, you look at the C series aircraft that Bombardier created a number of years ago, and it's one of the most effective, efficient, mid-sized commercial airlines created in a long time, very fuel efficient, and they couldn't sell them because the U.S. put a huge tariff on them. I think 300%, and and maybe the rest of the world had less confidence for whatever reason. They were afraid that they couldn't take on, let's say, Boeing or Airbus,
Airbus. Yeah.
and but I mean, Canada should have kept financing that. That was a great plane, and had we kept pushing it, I think the sales would have been well. But now, Airbus has bought that series airplane with some advantages for Canada, some manufacturing in Canada, but now they've sold or they've got orders for hundreds of those planes across the world,
Yeah.
and it's just like Canada should have funded that, and we should have stuck to our guns and kept pushing it, and it eventually would have broken through those barriers, and sales would have come through. It'd be the same for a fighter aircraft in Canada or other innovations that we could do. I mean, these things aren't done without serious government backing, and I think Canadians have to realize it takes big dollars. I mean, Boeing is successful because the government put tons of money into them in the past, and same for Airbus. I mean, Air France put a tons of money into Airbus, and only if the country supports these in this current market do they take off. And Canada's got to be willing to step up and really put the funds behind those innovation and new products in Canada. Um, I couldn't really think of one product that is known in Canada now, like that's known worldwide, like someone that says, "Oh, this is a Canadian product." And I mean, the biggest one I could find was Canadian maple syrup, mainly from Quebec, and I thought that's what we're probably known for as
That's
an
what we're
international
known
product.
for. We've got problems.
Is maple syrup, like not no longer phones anymore like we were for a short while with BlackBerry,
Yeah.
no longer Nortel, which was a world communications leader. Like Canada's doing something wrong with defending and supporting its biggest companies, its multinational companies, where we don't seem to have really any right now. And even Bombardier is probably a bit of a bit player now, but still around. But yeah,
Well, I mean, this is the history of Canada.
yeah,
We have smart people. We have innovators. We have people who are willing to develop. I mean, you look at the technologies that Canada has developed over the generations. The telephone, the electron microscope, the C series aircraft. We had our own fighter jet.
yeah,
The Avro Arrow, which was the top of the line fighter jet at the time it was developed,
yeah.
and in an act of industrial vandalism, which I think was the worst case of shooting yourself in the foot in Canadian history, the Diefenbaker government decided to not only cancel the program but destroy everything that had been created. Now,
Yes.
luckily, some of the plans and blueprints and so forth were saved by people who had worked there. And even if you took the technology or the design of that airplane and used today's technology to rebuild it, there are aerospace engineers who say that it could still match what is out there right now that we're looking at foreign countries to buy. Like that could be reconstituted if Canada worked with industry like with companies like Saab or Dassault or Airbus to redevelop our own industrial military infrastructure, which we have very little of because a lot of
Yes.
the stuff we buy, other than our ships, which are built in Canada, our naval ships, a lot of the stuff that we buy, the aircraft certainly, are bought from overseas, from the US and from Europe. And yet we have the third largest aerospace sector of any nation in the world. So if that's the case, then why is it that we can't leverage that to create something that is Canadian made, suited to Canadian needs?
I think we can, and we may be at a unique time right now where the Canadians might support something like that, or a lot of Canadians would support something like that. But I don't see any of the three parties stepping up to propose that. Like it's a little bit it's a little bit disconcerting that parties aren't willing to do that. So,
That's
but
too
that's where we're
socialist
at.
for them. Know what you're saying?
I think I think the parties in Canada is a bit too socialist, and they're worried that they're going to lose. Like they don't want to put money into that military, and they're a little bit. I mean, I'm pretty left wing myself, and I'm pretty socialist. But at the same time, to me, it's socialism is what you do after you do the basics, and the basics are you need a good business, a thriving business. You need a military. You need a number of healthcare, education, etc. You need all these basics, and then the additional social programs come on top of that. And Canada, I'm afraid, or at least some people in Canada, put those social programs first and then cover the essentials with what's left over, and that's left us lacking over this past number of these past decades.
Well, but I think that the reason that we are in the situation we're in is this almost cult-like mantra that we have to have tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts. And if we want to see where we're headed, all we have to do is look at the US. I mean, we constantly score higher than the US on practically every international metric, except for the number of prisoners incarcerated per capita
Yeah,
and military spending. But in all the things that matter, happiness index, safety index, democracy index, government corruption and so forth, we constantly score better, generally in the top 5 or the top 10 at least, of all the nations of the world, whereas the U.S. is generally lagging, usually, in the high teens or even in the 20s or 30 range. So we are definitely better, and all you have to do is look at the kind of society we could build, is to look at the countries like Finland and Norway and Sweden and Denmark and Netherlands, which is, the sort of society we should be aspiring to. And yet, because we live next door to the elephant, there's this constant comparison that we have to basically be more like the US. And frankly, as a Canadian, I'm sick of it. I'm sick of us trying to have a race to the bottom, which is what we would be doing if we followed the US lead.
Yes, I mean I can see that, and and a lot of people see that in Canada now. We see our society become more polarized, more like the U.S., more left versus right, more similar to the U.S. almost each year, or each decade. And I don't see how we change that trend. I mean, we tend to be moving, like you say, a race to the bottom, where where we're not really wising to those certain situations. I mean, I do think we can change. I think there needs to be like some real vision. I think one thing that would really change it is if, and it's not going to happen this election, and I don't know if it'll ever happen, but I mean, if we could actually put either a government like the Liberals or NDP in place that changes our system to proportional representation and it shakes up this two-party system, I think we'll get a lot more of programs which reflect the Canadians public's opinion. But at the same time, we're still focused on social programs, healthcare. These are important things, and healthcare has dropped over the last number of years. I mean, the biggest issue, of course, is in Canada and the U.S. and a number of countries and across the world is this increasing wealth inequality. And until we find a method or a program to deal with that, things are going to continue to get worse in all these developed countries. And it gives fodder, and we see this in Canada and some other countries in the world where we're moving to a pay healthcare, a dual system where there's this pressure where we sort of don't fund the healthcare enough or we don't manage healthcare well enough. The people's satisfaction with that drops, and then the impetus or the support for a two-tier system or a pay system becomes higher and higher. And then we're in that slippery slope that the U.S. is in, or the U.S. is in, where people have to pay more and less people are coverage, and the care gets worse and worse. And I mean, it's once again, it's not even part of it. I don't think of the main party's platforms right now. With the current facing Trump, I haven't seen any mention of dealing with healthcare. I do see housing as an issue. I think for all the parties right across the board want to deal with the housing prices and the shortage of housing. But who does the best with that, and how that plays out, it remains to be seen. I don't know if either party is promoting very much to actually build, let's say, what would you call it, subsidized housing or socially supported housing. I do see, let's say, the Conservatives putting programs in place where they cut bureaucracy or they cut processes, and I see the Liberals putting funding in place to help build more houses, etc. It remains to be seen which ones will really address it. I don't think neither of them are attacking the problem the way it needs to be attacked, but we'll see.
Well, I think that all this comes back to something we talked about in our last episode, which is the issue of fair taxation. We've had for decades now right-wing think tanks and right-wing politicians constantly pushing this agenda of taxes are too high, taxes are too high. Well, you know what? If taxes are too high, just look at the countries that have the lowest taxes. They're not exactly the most stable countries in the world. And look at what's happening in the U.S. This is a country that has lower taxes, sure, but it also has people constantly going bankrupt because they can't afford health care. You've got, very high homelessness. You've got an education system that's crumbling. And the only people whose lives are getting better are the people with money,
Yeah.
the people who can afford it.
It's funny
And
too because they have incredibly low taxes in the States and they could provide really good health care, really good social programs with only a slight increase in taxes. Like they're such a rich country, they could provide a really successful country if they wanted to. And it's funny how these billionaire oligarchs and these wealthy people want to support even less taxes for the uber rich, for people that don't need the money and probably even aren't even that happy with as much money that they do. I think a lot of them are fearing that they're going to have an uprising, and so they're building bases in remote areas to defend themselves when the uprising comes. But um, I don't understand why the mentality when they have so much wealth and they could fund those things and their economy would be so much better off. I don't understand. I mean, I know where it comes from. It's the individuality in the States. Like, we don't support you. You have to support
You basically have
yourself.
to pick yourself up by your own
Yeah,
bootstraps.
exactly. Pick
Yeah,
yourself up by your own bootstraps.
which
And
which is such BS because
yes,
nobody got anywhere without getting help by somebody along the
yeah,
way, whether it was parents or teachers or mentors or people who decided that they saw something. Um, you know, Elon Musk didn't become a billionaire all on his own.
no,
He actually started from a very privileged place in life.
yes, he did. Yeah, and he
You
leveraged
know,
ideas that were already being done by someone else. Like, I mean,
yeah,
the
exactly.
Tesla
He's
car
not
was invented
inventing
and created by
Tesla.
someone else. He just came in as an investor and sort of took it over. So I mean, he's I mean, he's quite a driven personality, but he's building on the infrastructure and the work of thousands of people and creators before that.
Yeah.
Same with, like the Amazons of the world. I mean, this internet and everything else that he built on top of was done. Is something he's building on top of. So it's a collaboration between thousands of people.
Well,
So
yeah, because the people who succeed today are standing on the shoulders of giants who came before them.
exactly, yeah,
To say that I did this all by myself is such arrogance. It's unbelievable arrogance. And unfortunately, that's the mentality of a lot of people who have a conservative outlook in politics or in life. That basically you have to do it on your own. And yeah, if you do it, if you achieve success, we'll fet you. But until then, go away. We're not
yeah.
going to be bothered with you. And I think that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people are feeling like we are devolving as a society, and why things are getting worse rather than better. I don't know about you, but when I was growing up, I grew up in Toronto, and I had such optimism for the world, even during the height of the Cold War, when the world could have been destroyed with the push of a button. I still saw hope for the future. And then the Berlin Wall fell, and it was looked like, oh great, life is going to get better. But then over the last 20 years, I don't know what has changed that that I don't feel as optimistic
Well, I
about the
don't think. I
future.
mean, economy was booming and people were being successful and people were getting good jobs and thing was going up and today it's sort of the reverse. The good jobs are getting less and less. More and more people are in mick jobs, as they used to call it, in that
A
Gen
gig
X.
economy,
Yeah,
gig jobs.
yeah, gig jobs, exactly that as well. And so it's changing. So I mean, the world is not as a supporting place as it used to be back in the probably the 80s and early 90s, and it wasn't as optimistic. So that was a good session today.
Yeah, so
Any
I guess
last
we went a
words?
bit off topic on
Yes.
that last, but we talk about important stuff, and this is
Yeah.
important stuff to talk about. As we started out saying, the election is on April 28th. Everybody should make an effort to vote. I think we are going to see, given the importance of the issues that are being discussed and the threat to Canada, I think we are going to see much higher voter turnout this time than
Yeah.
we have seen in the last couple of elections. And so I encourage listeners and viewers to basically make sure that they're on the voting list. Check with Elections Canada, go to their website and see whether what you need to do to make sure that you are on the voting list, so that you can cast your ballot when the time comes.
Okay, great point. So thank you, folks. Note that you can find our podcast on most podcast providers, on Podbean and on yinsights.org/podcasts. The music in this podcast is Trials by Bladen. Thank you for listening, and hope to see you next week. We'll have more discussions around Canada election 2025.
Look forward to it.
Thank you.